This morning I drove over to Windsor Plywood and I picked up a nice little supply of oak lumber. You know, I've lived in Winnipeg now for almost 50 years, and this is the first time that I've been to Windsor Plywood. You know, this is pretty nice lumber for the most part. These guys are going to get my business again. Now obviously there's more than enough here to make one clock, at least the consistory room clock. And you know, at this point I still don't know what it's going to look like. Okay, I've sort of come up with this idea. I don't know if this is exactly how it's going to look, but this is the general shape. And now I just have to convert the general shape into the real thing. Now, without question, at least for me anyway, turning the spindles is going to be the most difficult part of making this clock. So I'm going to do this first and get it out of the way. That way if it doesn't work out, I can always change my design. I've printed out the spindle full scale onto paper so that I can make up a template, and that way both spindles will be the same and exactly the way I drew them in the computer. The template will be mounted into the lathe duplicator, and what I'm doing here is I'm just taking a piece of scrap wood and I'm straightening out one edge, and that way when I paste the paper down on it, everything will be nice and straight. Now if I profile the template exactly the same way as I drew it out of the computer, it should look okay. Remember back in video 1 I mentioned that there was a professional furniture maker who had been turning since he was 15? Well, he wouldn't need a device like this to get duplicates. He'd just do it all by hand. This cutter is still fairly sharp, however I like to have it at its best for the next time I need it. There now, all ready for the next time. I'm going to be sanding these spindles by hand, and I have to be very careful not to sand down the high spots. If I sand them away, I can't sand them back. I started out at 80 grit sandpaper and worked my way up to 600, and this makeshift dust collector worked just great. I've had this tin of stain on hand for at least 25 years, and I think there's just enough left here to do this clock. And this matches almost perfectly all that beautiful new oak that was put in the new renovation in that church. You know, I'm pretty happy with the way these turned out. The oak trim over the windows and doors in that church is a little bit profiled, and I have a cutter that's very similar to that. So what I'm going to try to do is make the top and the bottom of the clock the same as the doors and windows of the church. Now that cutter pretty well cuts a full 3/4 of an inch deep, and that lumber that I've got is only 3/4 of an inch thick. So what I'm doing here is I'm laminating a piece of 1-inch wide cedar onto the oak, and that way when I run it through the shaper I have a lot more to work with. You'll see what I'm talking about. My plan right from the very beginning was to be able to put an oak ring around the pendulum bob. I've done this 2 or 3 times before with other clocks and it looks quite nice. And that's why I put the oak ring around the dial. And once again I'm going to use some of that scrap oak lumber that I've got on hand. And if I'm careful and cut around those nail holes, it's going to look just fine and it's going to match perfectly with the ring around the dial. And once again, this is going to be just big enough. And I used epoxy glue on this. This way I can start working on it in about 2 hours. Otherwise I have to wait about 2 days. And here's another tip. Save those cereal box liners. They work really good for something like this. I'm going to make a tenon on the back of this ring. And that way I can put it on the chuck and I'll be able to turn down the face a lot easier. You'll see. And while the lathe is spinning like this is a great time to actually do the sanding, because if I was to take it off and do it by hand, the sanding wouldn't be as even as it is this way. I want to keep this disc as light as possible because it's going on a battery movement, so I'm taking the center out, get rid of the excess weight. I think I've got the profile of this oak ring pretty much the same as the metal disc. I'm pretty happy with this. And as you can see, it matches up perfectly with the oak dial ring. Okay, the glue is dry now on those two pieces I'm laminating together, and now it's time to get to work on the top and the bottom. Now I want these two pieces to appear as though they're just one piece. So here I'm just trimming them down a little, and I'm doing it in such a way as to lose as little wood as possible. It took me a good half hour to get the shaper all set up like this. A lot of checking and double checking. I don't want to waste any of that expensive oak. As long as I've got the shaper all pulled out and hooked up to the dust collector, I may as well change the cutters here, and I've got one more little job for it. And if you've watched my other YouTube videos on clock making, you're probably going to guess what I'm doing. You know, any Klingon would be real proud to have a battle axe that looked like that. Okay, you're going to see this piece again later, but it's not going to look like this. I didn't have the cutter adjusted quite low enough, and it left a little piece here that I'm going to have to remove now. I'm going to take it off with the router. Now I know it's best not to push the piece through in the same direction as the blade is turning, but this oak does tear out very easily, so if I'm careful here, it's going to work a lot better than if I was to go against the blade. Nice and smooth, no splinters, no tear out. Now for the back of the clock, I'm going to resaw a board here, and I'm hoping to do what's called book matching. Now after I split this board, I don't know which of the two edges is going to book match the best for the glue up, so I'm going to prepare both of them. Now this took over a minute, so I'm going to speed up the video here. I think I like it this way best. I know you can't see it too good here. You'll be able to see it a lot better once the stain is on, but each board is a mirror image of the other. Hidden under all those clamps are those two boards. They're being glued together, and we'll see what it looks like in the morning. Okay, it's morning. About 12 hours has passed now. And I can't help but notice that this still looks like two boards that have been glued together, and what I want is for it to look like one big board. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of work here yet. Well, that's not perfect, but it's sure a lot better. After running this board through the thickness planer a few times, it's taken it down to just a little over 1/4 of an inch thick, and I'm afraid that's not going to be too strong, so I'm going to have to beef up the back a little bit. So here I go with that scrap oak with all those holes. Well, that's okay, it's going to be at the back, nobody's going to see it. Now my plan here is to cut 4 slats that I can glue across the back, and that should strengthen it quite a bit. You know, I can't figure out why it is that I'm always making stuff look nice that's not going to be seen. Now once again, these little pins that I'm shooting in are not intended to hold the pieces together, but only to hold those little pieces straight on the back while I'm putting the clamps on. The clamps are going to do all the work. And once again, it's the next morning. Let's see what we've got. After the dial, the back of the case is going to be seen the most, so I wanted to do a really extra good job sanding here. I worked my way up to 1000 grit sandpaper, and this thing just came mirror smooth. Remember that short piece that I rounded over in the shaper? Well, that's going to be the pendulum rod. Now this oak pendulum rod and the oak dial ring and the oak pendulum disc ring are the only thing that's going to be varnished. Everything else will be stained like you saw me do the spindles, and then it'll be hand rubbed with a special wax to give it a nice subtle luster. This is the first of 3 or 4 coats of high gloss varathane. You saw the back of the case being made. Now it's time for the sides and the top. Now the sides and the spindles have to be exactly the same length, so I'm cutting them all together. Measure twice, cut once. I don't want to be wasting any of this expensive oak. I've got 2 vacuum cleaners running as well as the miter saw, so ear protection is an absolute must. And speaking of musts, I guess I must conclude this video. So I hope you watch for the Consistory clock part 3, and I'll be putting all these clock parts together and staining it and rubbing the wax on and hanging it up on the wall, and hopefully it'll be done. Hopefully they're going to like it.